primary goal, of course, is to make payments for our development purposes, trying to get the money to our destinations. And I hope to tell a little story in a while about an interesting problem we had with a payment there. So again, all of these come through internal messaging and then flow out through our SWIFT network. We're big users of SWIFT, as you would imagine. Although we have the name bank in our title, the World Bank is not really a bank. We're not a deposit-taking institution. We have to work through all of our banks. So on any given day, we may have issues of delayed payments, payments held up for compliance reasons. We may have an inbound swap flow, which we're in a particular currency, which we're using to meet debt service needs on the outbound side, and that inbound flow hasn't come in as expected, which gets us very, very excited. So there's some of the issues that we face within our treasury function.
And then very similar story at GE. So as you may hear, like we really operate organically from acquisitions and divestitures. So our company has about 200 ERPs across the company that we use to process either payables or receivables. 200 bank partners, 9,000 bank accounts. And so just the complexity of managing that and then all the supplier relationships is complicated. Whether it's getting a payment out the door and being able to make sure that the status of that, simple things like the status of that payment, we know where it is versus what it says upstream for the person actually managing that supplier record, to the collection side where we're trying to see the details, the remittance details that come in with those payments that get lost through the financial network. So that's we're managing that in 180 countries as well. So you have the 60 plus currencies like these gentlemen mentioned. So that's kind of what we do on a daily basis.
Wow. I like in Dr. Bernanke's talk how he described, I think it was he or Gene Sterling said the current system, the financial system is horse and buggy-ish, despite this very sophisticated, complex stuff you do. And that brings us to the next question, and I like this one, is tell us more about one of the biggest, for lack of a better word, screw-ups you've encountered, like when things go wrong, how bad did it get? I don't know. It sounds like, Paul, you might have one in mind.
We never have those. Never, ever. I'm sure none of you do either. But it's a close-run case, which I thought was the politically correct way of handling this question, actually. So we almost had a little disaster. So again, as I mentioned, the World Bank, different entities within the World Bank are making loans on projects. And these transactions are initiated by development specialists, economists. All of the banking services are aggregated in our treasury. We had a payment that was going in 2015 to Yemen. And this is about a year after the Houthi rebellion had begun and a conflict was breaking out in that area. So all of our correspondent banks, of course, are paying very, very close attention to any funds going into that region. Fragile and conflict-affected countries are always on our payments list. We're actually trying to help in all of these regions. So it's very, very important from our mission purpose. Well, this particular payment had been released. It had gone through to our correspondent bank, and they had blocked it for compliance reasons and come back asking us some questions about exactly what it was. So we, in turn, our staff had reached back to the team that initiated this loan in bank operations, and they came back with additional information, which we were busy cutting and pasting into a SWIFT message to get back to our correspondent bank. But this information indicated that it was money for some agricultural development, honey production, developing livestock. There was a second component that was in relation to infrastructure, and the last remark in this text was, and for building tanks. And we came within a whisker of putting that information cut and paste from one into another before we realized, well, are we certain we want to tell our banks that we're sending this money to Yemen to build tanks? Now, there was certainly insufficient money there to produce an Abrams tank. That was not quite possible, and somebody ought to have been able to figure this out. Nonetheless, these were water tanks, and so we had to go back to the team just to get a much better explanation of what we were doing. But that's the kind of issue we can sometimes face, that if we're not really clear about what our payments are for as they're going into fragile and conflict areas, and that we are licensed through OFAC to deliver these payments on these projects, recognizing the work that we do, we can get those funds blocked and tied up and inhibit our work and inhibit the effect of it. But that was a close run case that we had, sending money for tanks to a war zone.
Can you top that? Kristen?
I don't know that I can top it. I don't have as fancy of a story as that, but I'll tell you one story that we had recently where we were simply trying to make a cross-border payment to a supplier in Australia, and the payment got stuck with one of the correspondent banks, and we kept asking for a status of it, and we could not get a status. We couldn't get anything through bank reporting over SWIFT, and we couldn't get the banks to acknowledge the status, and so we reprocessed the payment, and it got stuck again. And eventually the bank came back and said, okay, here's what you need to do. And you can imagine the hops upstream in a corporate environment where now you have to go and amend the beneficiary information and get approvals and reconcile and all this good stuff. And so long story short, at the end of the day, we sent it through again, and then it became a duplicate payment because for some reason that payment that didn't go out the first time decided it would magically clear. And then starts the swirl of actually trying to recall one of those two payments. So that's really the day in the life. I mean, it's not an extraordinary circumstance, but you can imagine the magnitude of that in 180 countries and really trying to deal with the different currencies and banks. It becomes very complicated.
And how long did it take you to untangle that from start to
4 weeks. About 4 weeks, yeah. And that's people cost. Like in an environment where, we're trying to be very cost conscious, that's human FTEs, people that are chasing down these transactions. So it's that we're really lacking in, we always compare it to that Amazon model where, I order something online, I know I paid for it, I know it's shipping, they actually deliver it at my front doorstep and tell me it's on my front doorstep even though I'm not home to see it. And so we really like to see payments more behave like that.
How about you, Camille? You must have some good war stories from Airbnb.
Yeah, lots. I think part of the challenge for us, it's kind of looking back at our host community and really acknowledging what they do and why they do it. It's already hard enough for people to welcome strangers into your own home. One of the things that Airbnb actually does is has the host focused on the money, the experience, and not the money. And one of our promise to our community is that we're going to actually get payments to you within 24 hours after somebody checks in. A key reason we hold those payments back is actually to make sure the place is what it is and people are satisfied with what they've selected. So knowing this context, as you could imagine, not every part of the world operates effectively in how to actually unlock that money for the host, irrespective of when we actually send it. We've had multiple issues like yourself where by building this diverse network of partners to process payments, not knowing where they're actually connected into the local networks and not, we've actually had duplicate payouts. So some hosts have actually seen Christmas multiple times on our platform in a single year. But I'll kind of give you one specific example in Argentina. So we have a network of partners that we actually use to process payments around the world. But what we didn't know is that some of these networks and these partners actually use other networks and partners to get the money to where it needs to. And by the time the coding of the payment that goes from the first partner to the next partner, ultimately to the recipient's banks, the word Airbnb and what it's for has completely disappeared. And so you could send payment through one partner, it looks like one way. You send it through another, it looks completely different. And in Argentina, we had actually one of our network partners change a provider downstream. And what resulted in a pretty big issue was they forgot to tell us, and we weren't prepared for this, but since the recipient's banks in Argentina couldn't recognize what the payment was for and didn't actually identify that the deposit tax was paid for, that Argentinian consumers face when they actually do get a deposit in the bank, money just sat in that local recipient's bank with nobody to found. And so if you could imagine when the host started calling us, to look for their money, and they started a chain of events of tracking down payments. It took longer to track down that payment than it takes us to deliver a cash payment in a market like Cuba. And that was a pretty eye-raising experience because these people, they rely on that payment. And these people are not making hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're looking at Airbnb to supplement their income, and delays in payments is almost like missing a rent payment. We're not putting food on the table in some markets. So you can imagine the urgency that we have to act with, but with little help along the way.
Well, let's change a bit. The topic of the panel is, what can the banks do for you, or what's the dream bank? So, I don't know, tomorrow you could change something. What would make your life a lot easier? What would your bank do for you?
Sure. At least from my perspective, it's really about having that tracker on a payment. I know it sounds really silly, but being able to say, you know, I sent this payment out to this beneficiary, and I have complete transparency to that through the life cycle of it. I mean, we get annoyed. They take, you know, the banks take lifting fees off of those transactions. So the $100,000 you sent out becomes $999,000, and your, you know, folks on your team are trying to reconcile that back. Even if you had that transparency, you could follow that transaction through the life cycle. That's probably the biggest one for GE.
I have to agree with that. Certainty about payment, clarity, having information about exactly where it is in the whole journey is really, really important. What I'm struck by, I was trying to think of an analogy. I've actually struggled with it a little bit, but simply being aware of some of the benefits which may come from technology obviously awaken us all to what we might be able to do in our industry. So, I mean, I have to credit our banks. They provide terrific support. They've been reliable and good partners for years and years. We certainly couldn't conduct our business without our current banks. But now we seem to be entering this new phase. It's one of the reasons we're here, of course. And the prospect of improving reconciliation or improving our capacity to see exactly where a payment is throughout its entire journey, or increasing the speed of that, or driving down the cost of that, or making sure that a pension payment or a payroll payment arrives without having some fees taken out of it. You know, we really want to make sure we're delivering the amounts that are supposed to be getting to the target. So I think there are a lot of things we would love to see, and some of those come to mind now, simply because we're aware of the potential, I think, of some of the technological innovations that we're seeing.
It's interesting you both said tracking. At work, we have this ambition to be tracking pizza. Anybody know what Domino's is? So Domino's has this pizza tracker. And we kind of crack jokes about it, but you pretty much know exactly where that pizza is. From the oven to in transit to somebody knocking on your door. And we joke about it because ultimately our ambition and commitment to our platform and our community is to be extremely transparent in knowing where the money is. And if you could think about the number of people we service globally, and all the inquiries we get from our community, 90% of all payment-related inquiries are actually result of doing payouts. And if you really look at the 90% of those complaints, over 60% of those complaints are purely tracker-related. So I share the same sentiment. And ultimately, you know, I think the key aspect of providing that tracking to in our community, especially a community that's built on trust, is really we focus on transparency, incredible amount of transparency, and getting the money to them so they can actually use it. And what we've actually started doing to address that, because the banks are slightly behind in how they approach, and each market is different. Believe it or not, PayPal is preferred as an alternative to bank payouts because they know they can log in and see the money the second we push it. Not that they could actually take it out and then go do something with it. There is another hop, but they know that they actually got it from us. And so the community is actually starting to adopt other forms of payments just for the sake of transparency and speed. So I'd agree with you.
Very similar. The only other thing I would add too is, you know, you hear us talk about how we're trying to make payments faster and more real-time, same day. With that comes, I know the three of us balance just the fraud side. I mean, the cybercrime stuff right now has hit us full force, and it's basic stuff of people mocking up invoices and things like that. So while we're trying to make accurate payments and make them quicker, we're trying to also counterbalance all the fraud, and some of these new technologies allow us visibility, which is probably step one of preventing that. So it's another thing that we think about a lot.
It sounds like a great segue into blockchain, because you're talking about tracking, recording, watching where things go, and blockchains allegedly are excellent at that. But just curious, who in the room is familiar with blockchain or could define it if they had to? That's pretty good, because this is a specialized audience. How many have actually used blockchain? That's pretty good too.
You need to swap seats.
Yeah.
All right, come on up. Yeah. Distributed ledger technology? Sure. So what about you guys? So we're hearing a lot about it. Are banks kind of coming to you with, hey, this will solve your tracking, your fraud prevention issues?
I can touch on that one. I mean, we have two use cases that we're doing at GE with blockchain. So one, kind of unrelated to payments, is just, you know, we have those 200 or so ERPs across the company, and constantly reconciling between them of intercompany transactions, right? So a lot of the flows that corporates deal with are GE to GE flows. And so could blockchain serve as a utilization to really be that source of truth, so that you don't have to reconcile back and forth and have a lot of tying out between the systems. Where we've seen the banks come into play is a couple of them are piloting blockchain to basically move money around the clearing system so that they can have more control and transparency. So it gets back to what we were saying with, if they can give us transparency to our transaction and do book transfers without having to go through a clearing system that might actually take away those payment details that we need, that might be a value added for a bank to offer a corporate, and so we're doing some pilots there as well.
My perspective on that is I haven't seen the banks, which I love, knocking our doors down to talk about how they might be able to bring some of the new technologies to bear on their business or our relationship. So it's not an active dialogue. And notwithstanding that, we're obviously very interested in this technology simply because we foresee it's going to have a broad effect, and we need to get ourselves into a place to know how to work with the new technologies, how to deploy them, how to make good judgments as the marketplace changes, because there will be some transformation there. So we're very interested in that. We certainly have two broad threads within the institution. One, as users of the financial system, the treasury piece, and that's the part which I'm speaking about, but also we have a great interest in the technology from a development perspective, and the institution is working hard with many other partners to try and explore ways of using this technology to deliver, to help with financial inclusion, and to really benefit the poor. But within our own business, at the moment, we're not seeing a great deal of activity. If we speak to our banks about what they might be doing, we often get into a conversation about DPI. If we ask to get involved in, say, some proofs of concept, it's a little hard work. It seems like a little hard work to me to get the banks to work with us on this. And I think this is potentially, it's a natural consequence of technology which is fundamentally threatening to existing ways of doing business. So I think we have to understand that. But it's the technology exists. The genie is out of the bottle, and I think we're going to see an increasing dialogue going forward. But I'm not seeing enthusiastic support for the technology amongst our banks with regard to me as a customer at this stage.
We've been fortunate enough to have some really good banking partners, and they're all eager to work on blockchain and help solve some of those problems. What typically gets caught up is they're waiting for the use case and the ROI to be defined before they act. And what ends up happening is that they become fast followers, not leaders. Unfortunately, in the problems that we're trying to solve, they can't be followers. They have to lead. And more our use cases, they're tied to individual people. We're moving money between people, not necessarily from company to company or intercompany as similar you have. And especially we're so spread out. Even if some banks are working on with blockchain, it tends to be what they could do within the bank, but not across the aisle with other banks and other banks in other markets. And so we appreciate the effort. I think we'd just love to see a little bit more action going forward. We definitely see the use cases. I think some of the banks on the Ripple protocol obviously have taken a progressive view of how to participate and how to execute. But I do think more and more banks are realizing the opportunity here. They're just looking for the right partner and use cases to drive this forward.
You want to name check a couple? Of who's doing it right. You don't have to name the laggards, but who's doing it right?
I know there's, there's smaller banks that are doing it faster, I would say. Larger banks like Citi and Bank of America have a bigger problem to solve because of their footprint. Where I do think giving teams the mandates and isolating them from the rest of the banking world to kind of go solve for these problems tends to be working really well. Citibank has done some really cool things, even in the New York Stock Exchange, building a blockchain around that. They have a Citi Ventures group that actually is investing in fundamental technology and supporting them. And also the other part of what banks, I think, sometimes weren't doing that well before, but I think they're starting to get better at it, is, people always say fintechs and startups are running faster than everybody else, and they don't necessarily understand all the regulatory problems. Well, I think banks could play a critical role in educating some of their challenges that they face in running that fast, and take the help that they could get from smaller players who move much faster to solve for those challenges. I don't think any of the fintech players are out there saying, we want to circumvent regulations or go around the banks. I think they're just trying to say, okay, let us understand what your problems and challenges are, and we'll work with you to get there. But yeah, there's a lot of banks, even in other markets like India, some markets in Brazil are doing some really cool things.
Another thing we're hearing a lot about is these different protocols. This gets a bit esoteric, but on the tech front, people keep likening blockchain right now to 1996 and like the advent of Netscape. Point being, we have all these sort of like cool internet tools, but who's going to make a browser to make it work for everyone? Right? Same thing with the email protocol. And right now we're seeing, who's going to win. Ripple's obviously out front doing a lot of cool stuff, but so is Hyperledger, and there's, other competitors there. So I guess the question is, what are you guys seeing? Who do you hear about the most? And is this going to be like a winner-take-all market? Is there going to be just sort of like one blockchain, or is there going to be a bunch of them?
You guys want me to take this one? Or?
Start it off.
I mean, I don't know that I definitely have an opinion. I think I am super excited to see the competition, though, between them and what that's doing, at least from a corporate lens. So we see the banks stepping up and coming more aggressively at us with solutions. I think it's the first time in my career that data is at the center of every banking meeting that I'm part of. Blockchain's talked about, RPA has talked about, big data and analytics. So I think the team, the solution that can kind of tap that first is the one that's going to sit front. There is so much data that sits, whether it's with a Ripple, whether it's with a bank, that we can tap into as corporates. They see all of our collections, they see our payables, they see analytics, they have data from the market, and I think it's just a matter of somebody tapping into that and really playing that back at us.
No, I mean, I think the opportunities are extraordinary here, and it's very, very difficult to pick winners and losers. I think the most important thing is the amount of competition which is going to be out there. In our world, we do require cooperation. So there's it's a large ecosystem that has to work together. So as it changes, everybody does have to work together to do this. But competition will drive the change. I'm a big fan of shameless commerce. It actually lifts a lot of people out of poverty. It gets new products into the world. It does good things. It's not all shameless, of course, too. But yes, Netscape was one of the first companies there. I'm sure Ripple doesn't wish to be the Netscape of the world here, or any of the other firms. But I fully expect this to go in directions that we can't foresee, and new players to come in, and new coalitions to form to drive solutions. But as I said earlier, I think this genie is out of the bottle, and a lot of the customers that wish to use it, and a lot of folks at a retail level understand what their needs are. A lot of corporates know exactly what they want to do to be successful in their businesses, and this will drive competition amongst the players, and hopefully good, successful cooperation to create a much more efficient infrastructure that supports fast payments and clear information about their entire chain. So I'm upbeat about it, but I couldn't speculate, which is what it would be, as to who might win and who might lose.
I tend to agree with that. But I think the key thing I'm excited about is there's no one blockchain concept. I think that's never going to work. Having a lot of different blockchains actually allows for individual problems to be solved in a very localized way to each company or market. But I think connecting it all together is the fascinating part, something I think Ripple's doing really, really well. Ability to have a common language across blockchains is going to be the important part about connecting the world. For companies like us, we don't want to get into building network again, meaning I connect to one blockchain with one bank, and then I go to another blockchain for another thing. I think having a protocol that's consistent across all of the blockchains is going to be important for the use cases to be developed faster and brought to market faster.
Let's do this another way. You all operate in a lot of different countries, and we've heard a few times the need for sort of governments to embrace the technology. And I know the Bank of Canada is doing some cool stuff. Maybe I'm biased, I'm Canadian. But as you go around, and Japan comes up a lot, but as you go around the world, where do you find the most kind of welcoming technological and regulatory environment that will uplift this? Maybe that one to start, Paul?
One which stands out for me. I don't wish to endorse any particular country's advances in here. I've been quite impressed with Australia's approach to blockchain and new technologies in fintech. They seem to have. We work with a few of the banks in the Australian space. They seem to have very strong relationships with their regulators. Easy conversations about what they're doing, making sure everybody's informed about any initiatives that they're taking to develop new solutions. I think it's publicly known that there are some significant projects out there in the space of real infrastructure. I think the Australian Stock Exchange is considering replacing its equity settlement system, CHESS, with a blockchain-based alternative. So I've seen, from my vantage point, a lot of activities going on in Australia, and a governance approach which seems careful, prudent, but quite encouraging of initiatives in this area. So I have been impressed with that. There are other countries that are moving very, very quickly. Obviously, Estonia. The Bank of England did an awful lot of research. It's thinking deeply about lots of questions. Singapore is doing some wonderful things as well. I think there are lots of jurisdictions doing some great things in this space.
Yeah, very similar. I think I would say Singapore is the one that stands out the most for us. We've actually put a lot of our treasury presence in Singapore most recently because of that. So just more advanced in the way that they're thinking about the fintechs, adopting new technology, being open to change. That would be the one that stands out to me.
I think the world is pretty large. There's a lot of innovation going on. One of the things I look at is innovation at scale, and what countries are going to be able to push that agenda and set the tone. I think with China being very forefront right now in terms of how they're looking at building solutions for the scale, even risk scores, credit scores wasn't even in the market. Innovating credit scoring system in a market that didn't exist and doing it at that scale and then lending against that is incredible. I think things that are happening in India with even though it's not on blockchain yet, the whole Aadhaar system and identity and authentication. I think all of these little innovative things that are happening around the world, it's a good sign that it could be applied and also done at a large scale. I'm a fan of a lot of countries and what they're up to right now.
Oh, neat. And as someone said in the last talk, we are at a crypto conference, so we have to bring up at least Bitcoin at least once, or other of the assets. I know we're here to talk about the rails, but a big part of the story these days are the incredible surge in value of these assets. A lot of people say they're speculative, but do you personally, or from your organization's viewpoint, see a benefit to owning the assets?
For us, I think one of our big premise and focus as a company is we want to economically empower our community to do more with an asset they have or a passion they have to earn more money. And in the process, our challenge is to develop trust in this platform so people feel like they can participate. And building trust between the community is a very complicated process for us. Whereas I think as part of building that trust and authenticating and identifying users and knowing who your customers are, and opening up access around the world, that tends to be a priority over Bitcoin at this stage. I think a platform that's trying to build trust to kind of go to Bitcoin at this stage it's a little premature when a lot of the world still operates in cash. For me, if somebody asks me which way do I want to run, I'll run to cash before I run to Bitcoin at this
You're
point.
short on Bitcoin.
For now.
Similar. I mean, from my perspective, very similar. We did, though, we do joke when I talk about that intercompany closed loop. We talk about potentially having a GE coin, right, where, GE Aviation and GE Healthcare exchange non-physical currency, right? So I think we talk about it as the art of the possible, so thinking kind of outside the box. But, yeah, we're definitely, there's kind of other bigger struggles for us right now that we're focused on.
I'll speak only for Treasury at the moment, but we do asset management, and Bitcoin is not one of the assets that we invest in. We're more of the U.S. government securities than cryptocurrencies at this stage. So from that perspective, no, we're not making investments. We're still very interested in what may happen in that space. I am struck, as you mentioned Bitcoin, that we have to mention it. I made some remarks to the finance groupings within the bank a little while ago, and I deliberately avoided using the word Bitcoin because it has such a tendency to skew the conversation. It immediately gets people off track, I find. Instead of focusing on a 9-year proof of concept, which has proven incredibly powerful, everybody focuses on the theft from an exchange or the theft from a wallet or the shady uses, perhaps, to which it's being put. And that really serious point, this incredible 9-year validation of the underlying technology, I think, is often skipped. So So I'm not sure we should mention Bitcoin.
Fair enough. But I do want to go back to what Kristen said about the idea of GE using a native token. This is, again, going down the rabbit hole a little bit, but a lot of serious companies like the idea of creating, a native token, their own sort of currency that's for use on their blockchain. I mean, what Bitcoin is to blockchain, the GE token would be sort of to GE. And it's a way to fundraise. It's just sort of a neat sort of financial innovation. But, I mean, again, I live in that rabbit hole sometimes. Is that sort of, are ICOs and tokens part of your world at all?
Not ours at all.
All right, so we'll have to wait on that one. We'll take questions a couple minutes. Just one more area I want to touch on is just the regulatory environment. Do you see it getting better or worse as these financial or these technologies come on board? Is it going to make your life easier with regulators, or is it just a whole new set of challenges? You want to take that?
I could go first if you wish. I would just say I'm heartened by what I see as the response of most regulators to these innovations. That whilst still caring deeply, I think Dr. Bernanke was reflecting this as well when he spoke earlier. There seems to be a healthy distance that's allowing the development of these technologies taking place. And even though there are concerns that for financial stability, for fraud and so on, the regulators have a deep interest in all of these things. Yet at the moment they seem to be allowing the technologies to unfold, for learning to take place, and I think that's a very, very positive thing. I was particularly struck. I liked something which Mark Carney of the Bank of England had said in one of his speeches in 2016. He was not going to allow the dinosaurs to crush the avatars, in referring to developments in this crypto world, which I thought that was a lovely way of phrasing his stance with regard to waiting until there's some maturity before acting and letting all of these innovations bubble up. That was a very big positive to me.
Yeah, similar. I think we've been pleasantly surprised. I would say nothing additional to what you mentioned, just that we're hopeful that continues, because we see a lot of opportunity with the new fintechs and stuff that have been coming along. So.
For us, I think I share that, right? They're willing to sit down at the table and learn, and giving the space to kind of grow. I don't know where every market's going to go and what regulators are going to make, what decisions they're going to make, but I'm happy that there is guys who are pushing them to actually think and sit down and look at the flows. And one of the things that we think about is, how do we proactively reach out to them and work with them and put soundness in our practice and controls of how we manage float and funds across the world. And getting their feedback early on has been helpful in some of our thought processes as we interpret their rules.
Great. Let's toss it over to you guys. Does anyone have a question for the panel here? Well, I'll let you think of that. I got one more, which is in terms of how long until this stuff actually arrives, because I know I write about blockchain a lot and we're hearing about it a lot, but there's a lot of moving parts here, the regulators, the technology, the banks, the organizations, and you kind of got to plug it all together till we're there. Do you guys want to wager any guesses on how long until your average workday is going to involve blockchain?
Could I avoid the guess and just talk about some of the things that we worry about? Sort of that.
Well, give us a guess and explain.
The technologies can have a terrific influence, and we issue a lot of debt. We'd like to see if we could issue a bond on the blockchain, for example. So, if we could do that, it might be a far more efficient way of doing business. Market structures have grown up because parties fundamentally don't trust each other. So there are third parties everywhere. We all have to have our own books and records for every transaction that we have. So we spend an enormous amount of time reconciling. Our auditors have to sample with our swap counterparts to make sure that we both have these transactions. It's possible to look at a branch of your business and see now, I wouldn't have said this 2 years ago, but see enormous inefficiencies and enormous amount of work that's going into things that might well in a short while be unnecessary. But we've got to get, just if I look internally, we've got to get our lawyers up to speed, our security people up to speed, our IT guys. We've got to have a much larger pool of folks capable in this technology. We've got to have our front office traders understanding exactly how this works, an entirely different dialogue with our lead underwriters. Who are they bringing to us? Are there other methods of us actually getting to borrowers, for example? So there are many more questions than answers, even in a relatively simple activity like issuing a bond. And that's why I'm not going to give you a date, but I do think it's moving fairly quickly. And the amount of energy and enthusiasm I see when I talk to folks that have grasped the technology, I think will bring it around fairly quickly.
So you didn't actually say a number.
That's right. Good.
A number to wager?
I'd say in the next year. I mean, I
1
think
year?
it's,
Wow,
I think
okay.
it's like pretty now. I mean, the euphoria of what it's going to be like when it's all connected and working is years out. But I would say, I mean, it's in every discussion, at least at my company. It's coming up in a weekly conversation, which is to me now. So I don't know if you think different.
No, I don't think different. I think we're in it and starting at this point. I'm looking for some key use cases to be solved, and I think payments is obviously an easy use case to kind of tag onto. The other use cases I'm really excited about is identity. For us, I think blockchain and authentication of users is such a critical component. And I'll give credit to some of these groups working on this. So ID 2020 is a big initiative by the UN, which the mandate is how do you get the billion-plus people around the world that actually don't have an ID. And they're literally looking at it and looking at blockchain as a way to solve for that, along with how to get them connected. I think identity along with payments is going to be a critical component in bridging those two things for scale. So hoping both progress at the same speed and one doesn't get left behind.
Interesting. Yeah, we're forgetting all the other exciting applications for blockchain, including one I like is they're recording diamonds on the blockchain. There's a company that's just doing that. There's more than 1 billion individual diamonds on a blockchain, and it expedites the clearing and eliminates the fraud and stuff like that. Is there any? And I like the bond one. I hadn't heard that before. That's really cool. Do you guys have any other blockchain sort of examples or use cases you're watching?
Yeah, trade finance is one in our area, so issuing the letters of credit, KYC, similar to authentication, but exchanging the documents with the banks. Those are the two big ones that we also see.
Let's throw it out to you guys one more. Does anyone have any blockchain questions or questions for Airbnb or the World Bank or G? Sir?
You mentioned something about GE maybe use a token of some sort. Can you explain what the thoughts are on that?
Yeah, so we joke about it, but it might be a reality at some point. So, just thinking about how our businesses exchange physical money. So, for our intercompany transactions, we're not only sending wires back and forth outside the U.S., but we're also paying the FX conversion fee on those payments. And that's a lot of money, right? And you go back to the conversation about people chasing. That's just, I call it wasted motion as a company to be chasing down a payment between entities. And even like one of our businesses does a lot of their own within business intercompany because of the complexity of all of our acquisitions and divestitures, right? So, we joke that maybe at some point we, instead of exchanging physical money, we use something like a GE coin and create that closed loop network where they could exchange that within themselves. And so, part of the complexity is that it has to be backed by a physical currency. So is there really a benefit of it? So, we talk about it's the art of the possible, thinking about it a few years out. And then maybe we'll be actually doing something in the future with it. So.
Cool. Sir?
Yeah, right now the focus is, primarily building these applications on private blockchains. Do you see like a transition in the future to actually building a lot of this on public blockchains when there's more utility within these chains? I mean, you hear the argument, the intranets versus the internet kind of thing. Do you see that playing out at all, or do you think it'll remain private and permissioned to certain participants?
I would. I don't think I have a good answer to that. I'm not quite sure how that will play out. There are problems of scale in certain areas, and you may need to compress who has access to a particular chain to allow transactions to move at a speed necessary for the business, for example. There may be other issues. I'm uncertain how it'll play out. I think it'll depend on the use. The number of participants that need to be in that mutual ecosystem with regard to a transaction. So it's uncertain to me.
I say similar. I mean, I think it's all about I don't know that it matters as long as we get the requirements, which are around like protecting it, making sure it's secure, making sure there's transparency. So I think whether that's public, private, as long as those requirements are there, I think we're semi-indifferent to it.
I think as more and more of these use cases are proven out, and people are going to start looking for some level of governance across connecting it to the public sector, right? Like having a public chain. I think that's the missing component. What kind of governance model can you put in on a public chain that everybody has to abide by? If you could think about like the Visa and MasterCard networks, they do a really good job of setting rules and holding people accountable for those rules, but also inviting people to participate. I think longer term, as you see a public blockchain emerge in certain sectors, you'll see rule books and governance around that as well.
Anyone else? If the room doesn't have any more questions, my final one to the panel is going to be, with so much going on, it's important to kind of read and watch and kind of get a guide from someone. In your case, can you name a person or a company you think everyone should keep their eye on for the future of fintech and blockchain?
Goodness, that's a tough one. To you.
Oh, man. Or put another way, someone who inspires you in this area.
I'll give you
Okay, go for it.
one. I don't know the name. I won't say the name off the top of my head, but it's interesting. I'd say 6 months ago, I wasn't talking to fintechs at all. And in the last 6 months, I probably talked to them every week now, right? And I was talking to this lady who had started up a fintech focused on Africa. And just the creativity, the quickness, the thoughtfulness around how they're approaching a problem statement and the quick outcomes they're driving. I would say anybody like that as a leader, and I see this without saying their name, as a company that's like a leader in the pack.
Is that BitPay by chance?
Possibly. And so, it's all about it's more about the approach. And when you see folks that have a real quick way to solve a problem and execute, I think that's going to be the key. So.
Okay, Paul?
Well, I would say what's inspiring is everybody that's involved in this new change. It's on companies like Ripple, they're hosting this event, and they're putting in a great deal of effort to develop new technologies that many of us may use in the future. It takes tremendous energy to push against the status quo and do new things. I think this is happening right across the space. I'm inspired that it might be too rich, but I'm somewhat inspired by the regulators with their light touch. We discussed that a little earlier, but it seems to me there's a very mature and decent thing going on right now. New technologies are being developed. People are putting enormous effort and energy into creating something new that might bring value to the entire globe. We care very much about financial inclusion and helping the poor, and we think these technologies are going to make a difference there. They're going to help us, I think, in the long run, improve the cost of our own internal administration, which is somewhat minor in comparison to the broader goals. But almost everybody that's involved is doing inspiring things, I think, here, and we should be all pleased about that. I think 5-10 years from now, we're going to see a different world, and that's a function of real work being done by real people, working enormously hard right now.
Yeah, I second that. There's just a lot of people pushing the agenda here.
Can you name one, though?
You know what? I'll talk about a politician, at least, in a different way, and it's not Donald Trump. I think Narendra Modi, if you look at his early days before he's rising up the political ladder in India, he was definitely against a centralized identity overall. And, when you see his rise to becoming a prime minister, and he actually gets behind Aadhaar to actually, really from an inclusion perspective, for people that actually need services. What turned into a small use case to solve problem for financial inclusion turned into a major solution for identity that 1 billion plus people are now on. So I think, I'm impressed by world leaders that are actually having the foresight and to change their mind when they see that there is something out there that could really help people and pushing the agenda on technology. So that's one area that I think the politicians and the world leaders are going to have an incredible obligation to not get in the way, but also be flexible in changing your mind, irrespective of what your prior viewpoints were.
Cool, a lot of optimism. I like it. So with that, let's give our panel a hand. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
You did well.
Huge thanks to Jeff for moderating. Kristen, Paul, Kapil, thank you very much. Another hand for our panel, please. Cool. Watch out. You're good. So we're very fortunate to have heard from the corporates, get them to share their real life experiences. Obviously, it's a fast changing world, a lot of complexities, a lot of friction. Really striking to me to hear some of the analogies. I think what struck me was with Kristen saying, if things could be more like Amazon, where you have that certainty and that transparency, So we've heard from the corporates. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to hear from some banks that are leaning in, that are kind of taking the charge and trying to think through things differently. So please come join us in about half an hour. We'll be back on stage with another panel that is called Follow the Flows. See you in a little bit.